I'm Kelly Forden, and I'm here today with Maurine Ogbaa, and we are going to be talking about her story, Goodbye, which was first published in Agni. And Maurine was recommended to me by the editor of Agni, and I'm so excited to talk about your story. So welcome, Maurine.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here and talk about it.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to. I have lots of questions. I guess I always like to start with just, an overview of like how the story came to you. I'm always interested from a craft perspective, whether, the character came first or an idea or just a feeling.
Wow, that's a great question. So often for me, it really is interchangeable. Sometimes it is a character that comes first and sometimes it's an idea. And with Goodbye, I would say that it was the idea, and specifically the idea of leaving oneself to be found by a loved one. And that came to me, and this never happens, but that came to me when I read about the death of David Foster Wallace. And so I say it never happens because I don't write about other writers. I read other writers, but I don't ever feel the need to write about them. And I'm not trying to imply that this story is about him, but reading about his death, I just kept thinking about the idea of leaving oneself to be found by a loved one. So yeah, that's kind of how it started.
Oh my gosh. So I don't know the story of how he was found. I know he killed himself, but I don't know how he was found.
So what I've read, and I don't claim to be the definitive account, so I apologize if any part of this is incorrect, was that, so he did take his own life, and he did it by like hanging himself in his garage. And then he was married, and I from what I understand, his wife found him.
Wow.
And then I kind of did not real digging, but it's not uncommon for someone to take their life and then kind of leave themselves to be found by their loved one, or to leave a note, don't come inside, call the fire department or something like that. And so I just thought, wow, like, what is that? Right.
Right.
How does someone make that decision, which to me is a different decision than the decision to end one's own life. So it was that sort of trying to think about that idea and think about how someone comes to negotiate that, like negotiate who's going to find them and to try to communicate that or to understand that. So that was the kind of the kernel idea.
That leads me into the first sentence and the first paragraph, because I was trying to figure out, is she dead? Is she alive? I didn't know. So, okay. So do you have the story with you, or I can read the first sentence?
I do have the story.
Can you read the first couple sentences?
Sure. Yes, I'd be glad to. He was gorgeous looking down at me, very handsome, both eyes red-rimmed but different. The left, all a crew milkiness, and the right, a swollen lump of sclera protruding like the bud of a new flower. Though his eyes were open, I knew he was sleeping, knew he could not see me. I rolled onto my side and heard that low squeak of cheap sheets against the plastic bed covering.
This is going to be another story where I'm just going to have to get comfortable with with being a little less bright than I'd like to be. Then there's the line, a few more lines down, where she says, the eyes that see, the eyes that cannot see. And then I wondered what specifically you meant by that. In those lines, I was thinking about both of them. I was thinking about a couple of dualities, both the husband character, who's named Dwight, and the narrator protagonist, who's unnamed. So on one hand, the duality of both of those, of people and the unnamed protagonist. There's this interesting thing about, in my opinion, about depression, where in kind of the throngs of depression, a person can feel as though they understand the world in a particular way that other people don't understand the world. And that other people just aren't seeing it. Right. And on the other hand, when people are with, loved ones, family members who are going through a crisis,
they often feel as though that person can't see it, right? That person can't see the potentials of their lives, the beauties of their lives, the love in their life. And so that sort of duality of a depressed person's understanding and a non-depressed person's understanding, and then just like grounding it in the scene of someone sleeping with their eyes open.
Right.
Right. So, you know, one way I wanted that pair of lines to work is on the baseline kind of surface level of this man is sleeping with his eyes open, and those eyes can see, but those eyes cannot see at this moment. And then have that kind of reverberate through with what the experience of being depressed. Right.
Right. Yeah. I mean, a lot of times when you were depressed, you feel like, well, I get it. Like the world is, I like see all the pain. But you're right. You're missing all the beauty. On the other hand, it feels like when you're depressed, other people are missing the reality of the world. Right. So that is a real juxtaposition there. Okay. So then it says in the same paragraph, the thought shook me and I remembered the bathroom floor and how I'd been lying on it when I left my body. So there I was like, okay, well, she's dead, but she's rolled over. And then, so does she not know she's dead? She rolls over and then or is she not dead? Because then she goes back and remembers their whole relationship. Should I wait on this question?
So no, I think that's it's so interesting to be asked the question because, and I welcome all interpretations, but in my, interpretation, she's not dead there. She's had an attempt, right? And so she is actually still alive. Yeah. Okay.
So when she says goodbye at the end, it's because she's made another attempt. Like she's going to make another attempt.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Good. All right. I didn't miss as much as I thought. I was like, I'm always reading for magical realism too, and there were some moments that felt really like that might come into play. And so I wasn't sure. Okay. But I feel better. Okay. Okay. So I love the specificity of he pinched the webby flesh between my index finger and thumb, something he knew I loved. And I actually was just listening to a lecture by Rebecca Mackay, and she was saying that, a lot of first-time writers or writers starting out feel like they have to have a lot of details, like he had a walking stick and he had, one tuft of hair standing up. But really to pick one detail that shows something particular about their relationship is kind of hard. And I'm just wondering, did that come to you naturally there?
So I've never heard that lecture. It sounds like a great one, but it's something that's come to me as well. This idea of specificity coming through kind of an economy of details, and those details, when they are so like economical or sparse, whatever, they come to what they mean or the multiplicity that they might mean becomes even more important. Right. And so I always, as I write, I really do try to do that with details, probably because I don't describe people physically as much.
Right. I noticed that, and I don't either. So I'm interested in talking to you about that too. But yeah, the specificity, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but like the specificity of that, of what he does, I don't even know that you need to describe people that much. That's a thing of mine. Is that how you feel too? Like, I feel like actions and interactions between people and conversations are better than physical descriptions sometimes.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think because, as a reader, I always remix. I think when I was a young reader, I would remix the descriptions however I wanted to, like these sort of physical descriptions that you sometimes see in like books of like the 19th and early 20th century. I would just, like if I didn't like the way the person was behaving, I would, whatever it was, if they had brown hair, if they were tall, or if they were supposed to be handsome or beautiful, I would just remix that in my head,
Interesting.
And so I think that perhaps, and I guess inevitably I kind of write for the sort of reader I was. And so I think that, the reader's going to remix some of these things. So if I want some of these things to come through as characterizations, the details can't just be, can't describe like a finite physical quality like brown eyes.
Right.
They have to describe something about the relationship, even if the relationship is in flux, or the personality or the character, even if there's going to be an arc or a change or anything there, because I think the reader is going to come to the physical themselves. Right.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that says so much about their relationship that he knows. I mean, that's a very like intimate touch, and very specific. And you'd have to know each other, spend time together for a while, or know yourself pretty well to know like this one tiny spot is the spot. It does say a lot about them. And also in the next paragraph, then you talk about the fact that he's a hardwood floor person and that she had, like more of dingy carpets and the fact that he loves to make the bed, which is so fascinating just from a character perspective, because he's like this kind of he's got brown hair, brown eyes, right? And he's a poet and he wears glasses and then he loves to make the bed. And that's sort of a surprise just because I'm picturing like this messy guy with his book wandering around, just sort of in the clouds. So that was a good detail too. And it's a good juxtaposition for them too. Like, right. He has one thing that he's used to and she has another.
Right. And just I was thinking about how, again, because the generative idea was about how someone would decide to leave a loved one and then to leave oneself to find a loved one, or leave oneself to be found by a loved one. I thought about just the things we identify as idiosyncratic of our partners. And so I think she also finds these things she's also noted these things as differences, right? And the idea of, as a woman who has relationships with a man, or with men, it's always great to find out he's not a slob, but then to find like his non-slobbishness to be annoying, it also becomes like idiosyncratic of oneself, right? And then this, and so one of the things I loved about that detail is because it allowed me to go into narrative, which you can't always do, and which stories don't always allow for, depending on their shape and their pacing. But it was a gem for that reason.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell me a little bit about the shape. So then, when you were starting out in the story, how did the shape come to you of the story, since you mentioned narrative?
Yeah, that's a great question and really a challenging one, because I don't think I knew, I didn't know the shape. I had to get a few drafts in. And so, the first draft was getting her voice. Mm-hmm. And I always, after the idea, so the idea did come first, but after that, it was just the voice in my head and allowing myself to hear the voice. And then I started writing it. And I wasn't sure if it would be the shape that it is now, which is, I almost think of it as kind of if you had diamonds on a page, not actual diamonds, but the shape of a square turned on its side, almost page breaks, right?
Yes.
And so it's this point, and then it goes out, and then it comes in, and then there's this pause, and then it does it again. Right. And so there's this, and so for me, that's the shape of the piece. But for the first two drafts, at least, I didn't know if it would have what I think of as like a more traditional shape where, there's not as many breaks, and it, the time is really clear. The progression of time is really clear. The passage of time is really clear. Perhaps there's a unity of time, is that going to be a revision that's going to happen? I wasn't sure, in the first few drafts, if that was going to happen. And I definitely experimented with that, but this seemed the most appropriate shape for it. And I thought it earned itself, both the passage of time and also the indeterminacy of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it had that feeling of when a person is depressed, how you're just sort of, floating in thoughts, and the thoughts are coming randomly in memories, and there's not a lot of sequence to it, if that makes sense. She's thinking back to their relationship and how they got in this situation. And it just felt very organic, the way that she would come to these different vignettes. I didn't realize there was that shape, but I just felt like she was popping in and out of different times in their relationship. And
oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's also what I see when I stand back and look at it, her entering. Yeah. Like, I love that, popping back, but yeah, entering different points in the time, almost as though, she wants to recall the narrative, right? And she wants to recall the beginning, and she wants to recall even in somewhat, and I'm thinking about it as trying to think about it as the non-writer, but even somewhat dispassionately, like recalling how they came to be in love, how they came to be married, how they came to be partners with each other. And I don't want to jump ahead to a question, but, she says, I was his wife, he was my husband, and so. Yes.
Yeah. And then, right. And I was going to ask about that when we get to that part, because that is an interesting moment. But I did want to skip over. So I have it printed out on my own sheet, so I can't say like what page it's on exactly, but it's a paragraph that starts, and it's 3 sheets in my little printing. But I once knew a girl who wrote a story in middle school that got her into trouble. The people who believed the story was true considered the girl in trouble. The people who believed the story was fiction considered the girl troubled. The girl thought that everyone was saying the same thing: trouble, in trouble. It's all a matter of narration. And it's so true, because I can't tell you how many times, like, I also teach a class called Let's Deconstruct a Story. So many times people interpret things like that. And so I'm just curious what you meant there when you said that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things is that she's a writer. I made her a writer partly because I'm a writer. And I just thought, thinking about writing and then writing, again, I have the experience that I think you have as the instructor of this course, where people read your work and aren't sure where you begin and you end on the page. Yes. And so, and sometimes that can keep your work from being evaluated or being considered or being appreciated, right? And so part of it was my own thoughts on how to write a story about someone who's depressed without everyone thinking it's me. Right. And I leaned into that by making her a writer, because, part of it, I thought they're going to think it's me anyway. And, and maybe some of that's fair. I am someone who's struggled with depression, who's experienced depression and, been in therapy for it. And so I thought, folks are going to think this is me, whether or not I have that history or not. And so I'll lean in and make her a writer, because maybe that becomes another wrinkle. And then of course, the epistolary form. So not just the first person, but this idea, that she kind of says at the end, that's why I'm writing this. But this paragraph is meant to be tricky, is meant to be hard to nail down, because as someone who's also taught a lot at a lot of different types of institutions, I've taught at community colleges, I've taught at 4-year colleges, I've taught at universities. When a person, particularly a young person, submits something, sometimes you think, is this person okay? Is this person in trouble? And so how do we understand that? Understand, is there autonomy with the written word? Is the written word separate from us? And so that paragraph is meant to be difficult to pin down, a bit wiry. Right. And I hope it speaks to one of the things I love about this protagonist is, and I think that this is true of so many people, even as they're depressed, but is kind of her level of provocation, her level of, for lack of a better word, fight, and even bite. And this is kind of that paragraph where she refuses. And even the I once knew a girl. So she's now writing about someone without revealing it's herself. Of course, we suspect it's herself, just as we suspect authors, often women authors of color. And I'm a Black female author. We often suspect that they're mining autobiography in a way that we don't suspect it of men. And so here she's calling that out, but refusing to reconcile it, like refusing to say what it means.
Yeah. And I had skipped over the 2 paragraphs before that, because 2 paragraphs before she says, after that night, I had the exhausting, unquenchable desire to be the best he ever had until his something better came along. It was oppressive in a way. So she's like working really hard to please Dwight. And then it says, I was always writing stories without characters or characters without faces. I don't know. The stories have been friends to me. They have betrayed me, but they have never been my enemy. And I thought, okay, so that makes total sense to me, because she's trying so hard to please this guy. And then she cannot, like, if you're trying so, and I feel like this is the thing about writing, which is a really tricky thing. Like, you try and please people, and yet then you are censored in a way, or, you know, you can't. So that's really hard. I mean, not that she's being censored, but somehow the characters don't have faces all of a sudden. So was that, you meant that to go with her people pleasing in the paragraph before, or totally separate?
Yeah. You know how, and it's, I do think there's an aspect of like people pleasing where I'm searching for the word, but kind of like the messy part of you gets kind of edited out. Right. And so and it's interesting to think about it in terms of censored, but maybe it's a self-censorship, or like the self-editing, because you've constructed an idea of what would please people. Right. And maybe those people have given you some guidance, or, you've read verbal or nonverbal cues, but whatever the case, there's this way of you editing yourself or trying to cultivate yourself. Right. And so something like that is akin to characters that somehow don't have faces. And it goes back to that great question you asked me before about these little details, like the detail of the webby flesh between the fingers, because as I said, I think that when a character comes through, the reader has a face they draw up. But when details don't come through, or somehow when characterizations don't come through, those characters don't have faces, right? And the reader has this sense of, I've read all these pages, I don't know what for, or I've read all these pages, I have no idea who these people are, right? And so even a reader that, doesn't have you don't need a advanced training, but has this sense that somehow this character isn't here. And that seems to be like this character without a face that she's aware of, Right.
And so often it can be a really well-drawn character, like physically drawn, but you still are like, this person isn't really walking around.
Right.
Yeah. So he's white and she's Black. And
yes,
he takes her for Valentine's Day to this park that has this Confederate stuff going on. And I thought, well, that's kind of clueless. It was strange. And then there in the park itself, there's the fountain with the guy's peeing out of the hole in there, which is, again, there was just these moments where I thought, this is slightly off here. And it wasn't overt, but like, then these 2 little boys, they're remembering the park in Prague, right? The Kafka Park. And the 2 little boys had gone up to the statue and they're opening their mouths like and taking the water in. And then Dwight says like, we should have kids or something like that.
Yeah, that's such a great question. So a little background on me. I was born in Austin, Texas, and have lived in Texas most of my life. And that park came to me as someone who was born in Texas, who's lived in Texas most of my life, which is that you can go to a public park and there is, a plaque for Confederate soldiers, or you can go on the school field trip and you stop at the park that commemorates the Confederate soldiers. And that's part of, in places in the South, statues were built facing south, waiting for the South to rise again. So that becomes part of a social landscape that people, quite frankly, don't think about. And it's, I started this story quite a while ago, and you know how it is. You start a story, and I take quite a long time to write my stories, partly because I'm working and doing other things. And then you start sending stories out, and then eventually it's accepted. And so stories really have a really long lifespan before they're in print. And so it's fortuitous that this story comes into print at the time when people are more aware of these social landmarks and these physical landmarks of the country's history. But absolutely, I do think that Dwight was a bit clueless, but I'll admit that even as a Black writer who's, born in Texas and spent most of my life in Texas, I didn't write that to call out Dwight. And right. So I think that in so much that Dwight's called out, so am I, because right. I'm so used to it. And of course that park would have, and in the South, and I suspect in other parts of the United States, you have all sorts of, schools, universities, endowments who ask that Black people not share in that. You can be a scholar of such and such, and that such and such or that so-and-so is a person who's made his money from enslaved peoples, right? So
you just never know. It just comes up everywhere.
Right. It's there, and right. It's part of both this social landscape, this physical landscape, and then also part of an intellectual landscape as we're getting money from these people and the money is perpetuating itself. So thank you for asking that question, because I do think that it's a particular type of cluelessness of Dwight, but also of someone like me who was just raised in an area and had what I consider to be really astute awarenesses, but also not, right? Because you're so steeped in it.
Yeah, you get used to it, and you just, right. And that's the way that's the way it's written. It just sort of is there, and it's not, and it happens all the time. You never know where you're standing or what's happened there before. And so history is important. So her husband is jealous of their friend Walter, and she says that Walter goes for her because of her marriage to a marginally published poet, or despite it. And I was just wondering, that's so interesting, because Walter seems to me as more of a macho kind of guy's guy. I don't know. I'm just superimposing my thoughts about the male poet being more emotional and feeling. I don't know. So what did you mean there?
Yeah, and definitely. And so this is probably about the second page of any version you'll ever see of it. I absolutely was thinking about how, and I think she's thinking about it too, but how men make contests of women. Mm-hmm. And Walter is, he's Black, and he is described as a more masculine type of a person. And, I'm the type of woman Walters of the world go for because of my marriage, right? And so Walter, in her mind, as she has constructed him, is, quote, going for her because she is married, right? Because she represents a certain type of, if I can use the word, conquest or seduction or partnering. And so Dwight's described as a marginally published poet, and it's an experiment of the male ego. And so I do think, she is thinking about, and she does this later on when she describes Dwight's other partners, this kind of contest between people and how we come to measure people. And pretty much, and I would say almost kind of crudely, because for all the story lacks in physical descriptions, she gives physical descriptions when she talks about people. So Walter's described as tall, muscular, Black, right? And so those are pretty kind of these blunt edged descriptions. That's a character without a face, right? And then she describes Dwight's, former partner as, her hair, and, it's blonde, and it seems like you're Asian, and all of these sorts of things. And so I wonder too, and I suspect as the writer, that this is also the blunt sword of depression, mm-hmm. where you are you're using that sword on yourself.
Yeah.
And therefore you're also using it on other people, because it's the instrument you have and it's the instrument you're practiced with. And I don't explore this that much in the story, but I think there's a way in which this protagonist is measuring herself in ways that are really unkind. Mm-hmm. And the story doesn't really elaborate on race, but for all of that, it doesn't elaborate on race. She says, I'm going to find the line, but for all she doesn't elaborate on race, she's thinking about it. You've probably guessed by now that I'm Black, right?
Yeah.
It's this sort of conversation. Sorry, mm-hmm. Keep going.
Oh, no. I was going to say, I could sense it. There were moments where I felt that, like I could sense it. Like she says, I was fascinated by Dwight as a creature. And I think and then he has this at the end, he's like, we can start selling beer and we could do this and everything's going to be great. And then of course she ends it. I like that. She says, in that moment, I felt his love. I felt like he saw all of me and loved me with this knowledge, his mouth close to my ear. He said, we can have whatever we want. And I said, all of it and the statue. Like I was reciting a Sunday psalm, my voice clear and calm, sounding like everything but a believer. She doesn't believe we can have everything. And for me, I was feeling like, well, he's a white man and they always assume they can have everything. That's what I read into it. And and I don't mean that to be derogatory. It's just that history they have had, and even as a woman, I feel that even though I'm white, but I just feel like someone said about writers, it's the white male writers who feel like they can, go into, and it's actually white. I think they said it about all white people, but it is, that you feel like you can go into different minority groups and in writing and portray them. And that there's a certain sort of privilege in that. And so he also has this privilege of believing that everything is going to work out and he's going to start making beer and it's going to go great. So I might've been overreaching there, but I was reading into that's not the way the world works for everybody. And I don't quite believe you.
Yeah, I think that I don't think you're reading too much into it. I definitely think I understand Dwight to have this affirmative orientation. Yeah. that comes from his experience and his embodied experience being in the world.
Right. And that's not to put it, that's just his perspective. But right. Yeah. But it's different.
Yeah, it's absolutely different. And it's this, and she never, this first person narrator protagonist never shows any attempt to cross that chasm or to cross that difference or to reconcile that difference or even really to discuss it. She notes it. She kind of cites where the differences are seen or, where she has identified them, but it's not ever clear that they ever come into dialogue, right?
Where does she cite that? I'm just curious.
Let's see. This is about page 4. Our marriage. We lived. Don't ask me about that. I cannot say how happy he made me. Right. And so she starts that way. And a few lines down, she says, I was his wife and he was my husband. The former is where the problem comes in.
Yeah.
You think something is going to convince you of happiness. Right. And so that's one place I think where something about their relationship or their belonging to one another isn't quite an affirmative identity for her. Right. It's not enough in the way that just being something to someone else isn't enough.
Right.
And then one, the first one, which is really, really, first probably comes as superficial. As she says, he had grown up with hardwood floors. I'd grown up with dingy carpets.
Right.
And this comes to characterize one of their differences.
Yeah. And then later on, so in the paragraph that begins, eventually my mind came back to Dwight and I could hear him again. So this is when they're in the park, not just pick out the words like notes in a song, but hear the want in his voice. He was on a new tangent I hadn't heard before. He was saying that making something people consume was real creativity, that American hops were a dynamic innovation. I said, well, we don't make any money, so it's never really too late to do something. And of course, he looked away from me when I said this. So he didn't want to be brought back to the reality of the situation, right? He gazed out across the lawn, but I knew he was looking at nothing in particular. And that was maybe how I had looked while he was talking. Women do this. We listen more than I don't want to like generalize, but it just felt very like something a wife would do, listen and encourage. And maybe that's very antiquated, and I hope it isn't always that way. But so what were you thinking in that moment?
Yeah, I also was absolutely thinking about her kind of performing this role in labor, like this real like emotional labor of supporting one's partner in the way that's so often gendered for the female counterpart, right?
Right.
And then she says this thing that's, ambivalent and a little glib. And his response is, yeah, that's one way to look at it. And this was, I'll admit that this was where I was putting kind of a fine, like a fine point on things when he says, he's talking about American hops. He's talking about like being like a microbrewer, which I think of as a very like white thing, like a very like Caucasian American thing. Like I'm going to go and like brew my own beer. Yeah. Like very much hipster. But then also the idea that, not just that, but I'll start a microbrewery, like this is something that's possible. And of course it is possible. And there are all sorts of entrepreneurs and innovators, but for whom is it possible? For whom is it possible
to say, huge risk.
Right. To say, yeah. I'm going to go from, being a poet and, maybe like teaching at community college to starting my own business, right. At this point in my life, so many people are like, actually, I'm going to stay with this job that gives me health insurance and some type of retirement benefits. Right. And so this is a very particular kind of privilege that we don't name, and then we don't call out when we see it, like even on the page. Right. So,
well, and I love the way that it ends too, because it's so perfect. It gets to the heart of it, like she's just appeasing him and listening to him. And she's like, yeah. But, she doesn't believe him fully. And does it really even matter? Because he's just, I got the sense throughout the story, she's not asking for anything from him, really. Mm-hmm. I mean, he does when she gets sick and she's in the hospital, he does come and he's upset and whatever. But most of the time, it feels like he takes her to the Valentine's. And on Valentine's Day, he takes her to the park and he does make her happy. But I wasn't sure. She's so worried about pleasing him. I'm not sure what he's doing specifically to make her happy. She's noticing things about him, how he makes the bed and, the differences in the floor. I'm not sure. And maybe you said it and I missed it.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I don't think that, I don't think it's ever in the story. I think that's. He
knows, I take it back, because that one moment where he does pinch the
webby flesh.
Yes, yeah. Yes. So he knows that, which let's give him credit.
Yeah.
But yeah, it seemed a lot more about, just we're in her mind the whole time. And she's really thinking about like pleasing him and being there for him and listening to him. And yet she's, falling into this depression. One last thing, because I know we're like almost out of time. This section where people want to know why, people want an answer they can understand from a candidate they can vote for. Here I was molested. Here I fought in Vietnam. So that's just the section where she's reeling off like all these specific reasons why you'd be depressed. Right. Yes. And saying, I'm not going to come up with that. It's not going to be that simple. Is that basically?
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening here. Like, and it's another point where she's saying, on one hand, it's not that simple. And on another hand, I'm not going to give you the answer. Because she's not just giving, the here's are not just followed by things that could be plausible. The here I fought in Vietnam, she's just not the right age for that. Here I'm off to meet my maker. She says this thing about that kind of make you think that, that's not exactly the way she would think. And so she's really just, it's another point where she's evading.
Right.
And one of the things that was so interesting for me about writing this story was writing a story that was so fully committed to the first person protagonist narrator who was not either capable or even interested in communicating another character's interiority. And I think perhaps that's why we don't see Dwight, don't hear about the things he's trying to do to make her happy, because she's either not able to communicate that, or that's not what this writing is about. Her ability to, and again, I think this goes a little bit back to the eyes that see, the eyes that cannot see, her ability to think or identify different ways of thinking about this relationship is clouded or occluded by some aspect of her mental state.
Yeah. And like how you always feel less than when you're depressed, you just feel, you don't feel as good about yourself. And so, okay, before we leave them, she is going to kill herself, but because it says goodbye. And am I missing the part where I guess we're left with, she's not she sounds like everything but a believer, and we know it's coming. Is that kind of what you were thinking? Or is there a moment that I missed? I might have missed it.
No, I don't think you missed it. And so this was this was like a narrative decision or like a writer decision, if she's going to kill herself, how does this thing come to be? Like, how do we come to like read these pages? And so she, it says, I'll leave this behind, this piece of things. And that might be on your page 7. Okay. When you read it, know that I folded it into the pages of a Harlequin novel and dropped it at a book drive. And so
that's it. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
But then the story goes on for like a few more pages. Right. And so the question of what she does can never be known by the reader of it, right? Because she has to, and it's the thing with the suicide note, you have to write the suicide note while you're still alive.
Right.
And then sometimes people read the suicide note and you've committed suicide. Sometimes people read the suicide note and you are still alive, right? Thankfully. And so but because you always have to write the thing while you're alive, it can never, at the point where the person only discovers the letter or the note, they can't know anything more. And so that's kind of what happens with the reader. Right. The reader is not in the place where the body might be. Right. Right.
Oh my God. That's fascinating. Wow. Well, is there anything I didn't ask you about the story that you wanted to talk about before we go?
No, it's been a great discussion.
It's been wonderful. I loved it. And thank you so much for taking this time with me. And I can't wait for people to read the story and hear our discussion.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah.